If I talk about presyo, trabaho, and kita, everybody can readily relate, right? So I have decided since then that most of my economic briefings, especially for more general audiences, ought to just zero in on presyo, trabaho, kita. Of course, measured by inflation rate for presyo. Jobs is measured by the quarterly labor force survey of the National Statistics Office, and then incomes, or kita, is really the same thing as output, the other side of the coin, so to speak, measured by GDP, or gross domestic product. So it's really quite unusual that this time I can give you 3 pieces of good news on the predict test. Number 1, prices have been rather stable. The word on inflation for February was out just today. It was 2.4% in January. It just ticked up very slightly to 2.5% in February. But that means prices are in fact quite stable. Jobs have been positive. Unemployment rate is down to flat 6%. And it's not very often that we get that. And our job generation over the past year, consistently for 3 quarters now, has been more than 1 million net new jobs added. Which is very good because we get an average of anywhere from 900,000 to 1 million new additions to the labor force every year. So we have to generate at least that much to be able to catch up and not raise the unemployment rate. And incomes and output are positive news because in spite of the slowdown for 2014 compared to 2013, we are still, believe it or not, the second fastest growing economy, not just in Asia, but in the world. And this came out from Bloomberg recently because they did a scan of all the economies of the world and realized that China, of course, is fastest still. But we are already number 2 in the world. So we are really stellar in our performance globally in terms of growth. GNP growth is slightly faster, which simply reflects the fact that the income of Filipinos earned abroad has grown faster than incomes within the Philippines, because that's what the difference between GNP and GDP is. Some of you who have listened to me before may know that I like to explain it this way. Pag sinabing GDP, gawa dito sa Pilipinas. So apart from gross domestic product, think of it as gawa dito sa Pilipinas, whether it's foreigners or Filipinos who were responsible for that production. When you say GNP, gawa ng Pinoy, whether the Pinoy is here or abroad. So we count in GNP even the production and income earned by Filipinos abroad. Growers, and therefore the drivers of the growth here, are finance, which is banks and insurance, and real estate. And that's, of course, you can see from all the condominium developments and all that. And apparently there's no abating in the anticipated demand for real estate or real property development. The good news is if you look at private construction, it's still double digits. So there's a continuing brisk growth in terms of private construction, meaning private investments. The other good thing you can see here is that from a negative last year, exports have now rebounded to an even double-digit growth of the year. So while exports have been sluggish or even down in recent years, it is now recovered. And by the way, that is the reason why most of our neighboring countries, in fact, had recessions even. Kasi pag masyado silang export dependent, when the export markets sort of dried up, then they were more heavily affected. So it was a blessing in disguise that we are not as heavily export-oriented than our neighbors. Now, the ASEAN Economic Community is something that is all a lot of people's attention right now because it is culminating at the end of this year. Now, because of that, there are too many people who have visions of the Philippine economy drowning under ASEAN products, flooding our markets this year or at the start of next year, because the AEC DAO takes effect on December 31, 2015. It's important to point out that this so-called tsunami of ASEAN goods is not going to be coming. If it is to come, nangyari na dapat 4 years ago. Why? Because actually, unknown to many perhaps, the tariff rates on all the goods that we import from the rest of ASEAN were already brought down even 4 years ago to 0 to 5%, and most of it 0%. So nobody should really be fearing that because the AEC takes effect this year, next year suddenly will be flooded with ASEAN products. No real change will happen. Red tape an importer has to go through just to access their raw materials. We're helping with the Philippine National Trade Repository, which essentially gives a complete set of information to importers. What are the requirements they need to be able to comply with? I'm sorry. And then the Authorized Economic Operator Program, which will make it easier for firms to have a super green lane treatment in customs, and so on. These other permits and requirements that are being rationalized now. Very important for us is small and medium enterprises. Now, if those of you, some of you caught my Inquirer column last Tuesday, it was all about small and medium enterprise policy and how Japan has done a wonderful job with that. And then many complain about how hard it is to set up a business in the local area, especially outside of Metro Manila. Business permits take ages to finally get from local governments. A lot of work is being done on this now, so that some leading local governments, especially regional cities, pride themselves in being able to give you a business permit within a day, even within hours of your application. And then leave all the requirements later, within the first year of your operation. Don't require all of them to be complied with before you can even start the business. So that's the way to streamline it. The third category of homework, public investments, meaning infrastructure, and alam na natin what's missing, all these, and also public investments in health, education, and human resource development. When do I invest now? Tayo ko na muna malaman kung sino yung who will be the next leaders before you put your bet in the economy. So all of this can be the downside for this year. My sense is the earlier frame with the upsides here are still going to overcome most of the downsides. And therefore, for that reason, I'm quite optimistic. And of course, if you look at the other indicators, aside from the PT, there's financial indicators like interest rates. And this one is conditioned by opposing forces. The inflation rate, if inflation is high, the Bangko Sentral, and any central bank for that matter, will want to reduce money supply. And that's how it works. But if the growth is the problem, you want to lower interest rates. In other words, you want to loosen money so that it will propel more growth. And the way things are looking right now, inflation doesn't seem to be a problem. It's low by historical standards. And growth is something that people had a little bit of concern with because it slowed down last year. So the general internal environment appears to warrant continuing low interest rates. When do I invest now? Tayo ko na muna malaman kung sino yung who will be the next leaders before you put your bet. For that reason, I'm quite optimistic. And of course, if you look at the other indicators, aside from the PT, there's financial indicators like interest rates. And this one is conditioned by opposing forces. The inflation rate, if inflation is high, the Bangko Sentral, and any central bank for that matter, will want to reduce money supply. And that's how it works. But if the growth is the problem, you want to lower interest rates. In other words, you want to loosen money so that it will propel more growth. And the way things are looking right now, inflation doesn't seem to be a problem. It's low by historical standards. And growth is something that people had a little bit of concern with because it slowed down last year. So the general internal environment appears to warrant continuing low interest rates from the monetary authorities. Now, of course, what can affect that would be the external developments, like for a while the Swiss franc and also the US Federal Reserve monetary policy as well. Now, here are the more or less forecasts. First, let me start with what the international organizations, particularly World Bank and IMF, what they say. And this is based on the latest World Economic Outlook of World Bank and IMF. 2015 is 6.6 for the Philippines, and 2016, 6.4. This is World Bank, this IMF, World Bank, very similar. And that is faster than practically the rest except for China. So The only thing that exceeds that is really the China projected growth rates. And the world, global average economic growth is really much slower, as projected, only 3 to 3.5%, speeding up to about 3.3 to 3.7%.